Chipo, you wanted to say something on the role that traditional leaders have played?
Yeah, I think it's fantastic to talk about laws. I mean, Zimbabwe's laws are excellent. The constitution is beautiful. The question is whether or not those laws have been followed. In fact, how we came about with the discussion of traditional leaders is because a chief had been telling people that he supported ZANU-PF, and so that's how we came to this case. Now, the question is about the application of the law. We've had the Constitution since 2013. How many of the constitutional requirements have actually been applied? When we talk about the failure of the MDC to make inroads in rural areas, we actually ignore that until November, it was difficult for the opposition to campaign in rural areas. Even now, I was just doing interviews with people in Wedza. They were telling me that you couldn't see posters for the opposition party. So the opposition has done a lot of things, and I've written about their weaknesses. But I do think that it's important for us to realize that the last 38 years have not been a democracy. So when we talk about Zimbabwean elections as though we're talking about a democracy, I think we do the people of Zimbabwe a disservice. When we talk about coalitions as if coalitions don't matter, then it shows that we clearly don't really grasp how African countries have come out of dictatorships. Let me remind you of Zambia in 1990, that it was a coalition that took Kaunda out. Let me remind you of Kenya when they took out Moi, that it was in fact a coalition that took out Moi. Let me remind you again of Senegal, that it was a coalition that took out the dictatorship in Senegal and in Malawi. So you have to have a coalition of, even if it's of loose people, but with similar interest, in order to take out a dictatorship.
Joseph, what do you make of this, that there has been a very uneven playing field in Zimbabwe? In fact, the European Union Observer Mission said that a truly level playing field was not achieved, and there was a misuse of state resources, instances of coercion, intimidation, partisan behavior by traditional leaders, and overt bias in state media. Is there any validity to any of this?
As an independent observer and somebody who's followed Zimbabwe for over 25 years and who's visited Zimbabwe and went into the time when there was these big issues around land reforms, I just want to say this, that I totally agree with Chifu in the sense that, yes, we can't really take electoral process as something that happens within 4 weeks in any country, let alone established democracies. But one thing is a fact, that we all agree that the incumbent, it comes, and it indeed did come with advantages. Now, in terms of the examples, I think the argument being made is that ZANU-PF is not necessarily anything you can compare with a political organization necessarily in Kenya. But also, on the other hand, to be fair to Zimbabweans, and most of these guys are Zimbabweans, it's not necessarily true that, say, for instance, 1985 elections, there were necessarily major issues. The point really is this, that ZANU-PF, I think, played the opposition. As soon as Mnangagwa came in, he had the goodwill of the Zimbabwean people, said elections were going to be called, and of course he used the power of the incumbency, prepared and used the grassroots structures that they actually did enjoy over several years and brought them to where they are. But a quick point, though, is this. Up to 3 days ago, the opposition were actually saying they're going to win and win convincingly. Now that we're having a discussion about whether or not they've been rigging, I think it would be very useful if the opposition could come out and simply say that, look, these are the evidence of the rigging that took place in urban centers. These are the evidence that took place of the rigging that took place in rural areas. Right. Including the Independent Electoral Commission, rather independent observers. Up to 3 days ago, all of them were telling the rest of the world that by and large the whole thing went fairly well. Now, what has happened in the last 2 or 3 days?
If I may,
yeah, go ahead, Lloyd,
please. Right. You talked of the European Union response to our elections and so on. With all due respect to the European Union, they would judge the standard of our elections using European standards. But we have SADC in the African Union that have told us, according to our African way of doing things, the elections were free and fair and credible. I go back to what Chipo said with regard to the way we apply our laws in Zimbabwe. Let us be mindful that the inconsistency between the Constitution and our national laws is not a ZANU-PF issue alone. MDC has been in Parliament all these years with ZANU-PF, so we cannot single out one single party and say, because of this, it is ZANU-PF's fault. Let us be mindful that these guys have been in government together for the better part of the last 10 years. So we have to look at it objectively in
but
that
we can't
regard.
also cherry pick, right?
Go ahead.
No.
But
We're
we
not
can't
cherry
cherry
picking.
pick. On one hand, because on one hand, ZANU-PF is telling us that until November, Zimbabwe was a complete dictatorship and that Robert Mugabe was ruining everything in Zimbabwe. So if that was the case, then there is no way that the judiciary would have been quite as objective.
No,
so we really want to be careful about cherry picking support.
Let us be clear. Let us be clear in that regard. Until November last year, things had gone pretty bad because you know that Mugabe had literally consolidated power around him and his wife. We had a one center of power concept, meaning that everything was run from the president's house through his wife. So when the military, remember, this is a precedent in our history in the Mgagao settlement, where the military took it upon itself to remove a leader of the party who had gone rogue. Ndabaningi Stole, if you remember. So in this particular instance, when Mugabe was removed last year, the freedoms that have prevailed since November last year have been acknowledged by everybody, including those who thought we were a dictatorship in the past.
Yeah.
So let's give credit where credit is due. And what is the election result? What we're seeing today is actually Emmerson Mnangagwa reaping the benefits of those policy, of that radical policy shift.
Okay, Chipo, go ahead very quickly.
I was just going to say, he also mentioned that we should compare our elections according to African standards of doing things. And I think it's really important for us to clarify for the viewers what we mean by African standards, because democracy ideally should be universal. And in its simplest form, democracy is a government of the people, by the people. The will of the people should not be relative based on where people are. So I think freedom should not be relative based on people's location.
We could go into semantics. Democracy is defined differently in different parts of the world. So let's not go down that road.
All right.
It's a ship.
Right. I want to move on and come back to the studio here. Dorina, soon we will know the results. We will know who will be president. But if we look at Zimbabwe's economy right now, that is obviously a major challenge. Is there going to be a bit of a balancing act for the new leader? Maintain stability on the one end and then implement economic reforms?
Absolutely. I think, whoever wins, I think, has to be mindful that he inherits a very divided citizenry. And so there's going to have to be some type of olive branch or some semblance of, inclusivity, acknowledging that this has been very fraught, because if that sort of peacemaking isn't done, it's going to be very difficult to attract investors. And I think that was part of ZANU-PF's their campaign was, we are going to be inviting, investors into Zimbabwe. That's why he went to Davos, but there has to be stability first, and being mindful of just how split the country is, I think, is a first step towards achieving that.
Right, Joseph, how important is it for the next leader of Zimbabwe, whomever wins this election, to very quickly stabilize the country so that foreign investment can be going to the country?
I think it's extremely important, and that's why I'm saying it's extremely sad for those of us who observe Zimbabwe from a distance, that there are signs of developments of a possibility of violence and conflict. I think up to the time of the elections, starting from the time when Mugabe left, there was a concerted attempt from the Mnangagwa leadership and seemingly a consistent voice too from the opposition that Zimbabweans had rallied around themselves and they're prepared to let the Mugabe era go away so that with this election they could consolidate together in unity. It's important that whoever comes into power, without even looking at the economy, that whoever wins, ZANU-PF unites within itself, the opposition alliance unites themselves, and Zimbabweans unite together around a common Zimbabwean cause. And then from there, a clear leadership in terms of programs for pushing the country forward. I think one of the areas where Mnangagwa actually got advantage is the point that our colleague in the studio was suggesting, that Mnangagwa came to power and very quickly went around the world and showed an element of statesmanship, presenting himself as the next savior of Zimbabwe. And because the people of Zimbabwe basically, they've been so much battered that all they really wanted to do is an opportunity for them to come around and begin to be able to build the economy and build their lives around themselves. And Mnangagwa seems to have done that. At least maybe the state media and everything else, the power that he had, presented it for him. But to his credit.
Okay, I want to give the final words to Chipo and Lloyd. You have about 30 seconds each. Where does Zimbabwe go to from here? Chipo, you first.
I think what Zimbabwe needs right now are leaders that are kind. It needs leaders that recognize that Zimbabweans have suffered for a long time, that people are angry, but they're not unpatriotic, that people can be brought together, but only if the leadership acknowledges that the last 37 years or the last 20 years have been difficult for Zimbabweans and they need a reason to be hopeful. So I would urge strongly both the opposition and the ruling party to push a strong message of hope and unity, and to simply apologize for things that have gone wrong, and to promise that moving forward, leaders are going to be listening and kind and concerned about the welfare of all Zimbabweans.
Right, Lloyd?
Right. What we saw on the streets of Harare today is a terrible reflection of the type of leadership that we have, the immature leadership that we have in the opposition. So that has to be fixed. And if that happens, then we'll have the ruling party and the opposition sitting down and coming up with a roadmap to take Zimbabwe forward. Because it will not happen if the opposition plays a victim all the time, immature politics, run to the West. This has happened because a good player in an election knows that when you've lost, you've lost. You group up and wait for the next election. In the meantime, all Zimbabweans need to come together, all hands on deck, and fix Zimbabwe and make Zimbabwe great again.
Okay, that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.